The last time American and Iranian forces came within minutes of open war, most of the world was asleep. It was the 3rd of January, 2020, just after midnight in Baghdad, and a United States MQ-9 Reaper drone was already locked onto a convoy leaving Baghdad International Airport. Inside one of those vehicles was Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds Force, the most powerful military figure in the Middle East outside of a sitting head of state. A man who had spent 2 decades building a web of armed proxies stretching from Beirut to Kabul. The strike lasted seconds. The aftermath lasted years. And within 72 hours, Iran had launched ballistic missiles directly at American military bases in Iraq, the first time a nation-state had done so since the Gulf War. Both governments then did something extraordinary. They quietly agreed not to escalate. They both lied to their own people about what almost happened next. And the classified communications exchanged in those 48 hours have still not been fully released. That near miss was not an anomaly. It was a symptom. There is a man whose name appears in almost none of the mainstream coverage of the current crisis, a figure whose decisions in the 1980s set in motion a chain of consequences that runs in an unbroken line to the present moment. We will come back to him. There is a specific geographic choke point, one that moves roughly 21 million barrels of oil every single day, where a single incident could detonate a conflict that would dwarf anything the region has seen since the Iran-Iraq War. The people who control that choke point have been rehearsing for exactly that scenario for 3 years. Most Western analysts are looking in the wrong direction. And there is a number. A casualty projection that the United States Central Command ran in a classified war game exercise, a figure so far outside what the American public has been prepared for that when a version of it leaked to a journalist at a major outlet in 2022, the story was quietly buried within 48 hours. We will get to that number. By the time this is over, you will understand not just why a war between the United States and Iran is closer than almost anyone in the mainstream is admitting, but why both governments have structural incentives to let it happen, who profits when it does, and why every previous attempt to prevent it has failed for the same reason, a reason that has nothing to do with missiles or sanctions, and everything to do with the decision made in a CIA director's office in 1953. The roots of this crisis are not in the nuclear deal. They are not in the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping. They are not even in the revolution of 1979. They are in a single covert operation that the United States government did not officially acknowledge for 60 years, an operation whose blowback has been compounding interest ever since. If you have never seen this story told this way, subscribe. More investigations like this every week. Operation Ajax. That is what the Americans called it. The British, who co-designed it, called it Operation Boot. The Iranians, who lived through it, called it the coup. In August of 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency and the British Secret Intelligence Service engineered the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's democratically elected prime minister, a man who had done something that no Iranian leader had done before, and no Iranian leader would be allowed to do again for a generation. He had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is today known as BP. The British government owned a majority stake. The oil fields had been British-controlled since 1913. Iranian workers received wages that British laborers would have rejected as an insult. The profits left the country. The infrastructure was built to extract, not to develop. When Mossadegh's government passed nationalization legislation in March of 1951, the British response was immediate. An embargo, a naval blockade. And then, when those failed to break Mossadegh, a request to Washington for something more direct. The Truman administration said no. Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, reportedly described the British position as that of a company that had forgotten it was operating in someone else's country. But Truman was leaving office. Dwight Eisenhower was coming in. and Eisenhower's Central Intelligence Agency director, Allen Dulles, had a different view. Dulles signed off on a budget of roughly $100,000, a figure that historians at the National Security Archive in Washington have since revised upward based on declassified Treasury records. The actual sum spent on bribing Iranian military officers, newspaper editors, religious figures, and street mob organizers was closer to $1 million in 1953 currency. In today's terms, that is somewhere between $10 and $12 million. That is what it cost to destroy Iranian democracy. The operation worked with a precision that its architects found almost embarrassing. Paid crowds flooded Tehran's streets. Military units that had been bribed switched sides. Mossadegh was arrested in his pajamas in the early hours of August 19, 1953. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had fled to Rome when Mossadegh refused to back down, was flown back to Tehran on an American aircraft. He would rule for 26 years. He would be armed, funded, and protected by Washington throughout. His secret police, trained in part by the Central Intelligence Agency, would torture and kill thousands of political prisoners. Every Iranian alive in 1979 knew this history. Every Iranian alive today knows it. When Ayatollah Khomeini called the United States the Great Satan, he was not speaking in abstractions. He was speaking about a specific event on a specific date that had stolen a specific future from his country. That is the foundation. Everything built on top of it, the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, the nuclear program, the proxy network, the Strait of Hormuz standoffs, everything sits on that foundation of 1953. But the foundation is only the beginning of the architecture. What came next made the building collapse-proof. The Iran-Iraq war ran from September 1980 to August 1988. 8 years. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million dead on both sides, though exact figures remain contested. Iranian government records, cited by the historian Ephraim Karsh, put Iranian military dead at around 300,000. The total wounded on both sides exceeded 1 million. The United States did not simply watch this war. Washington actively supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq, including providing battlefield intelligence that helped Iraqi forces deploy chemical weapons against Iranian troops. This is not disputed. The Reagan administration's tilt toward Iraq is documented in declassified State Department cables held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Donald Rumsfeld, then serving as a special envoy, met with Saddam Hussein in Baghdad in December of 1983, weeks after a State Department report confirmed that Iraq was using chemical weapons. The meeting produced no protest. It produced an offer of restored diplomatic relations. Iran emerged from that war with something beyond casualties and debt. It emerged with a doctrine. Never again fight a conventional war you cannot win. Build deterrence through asymmetry. Arm proxies. Control geography. Make the cost of attacking Iran so high, so distributed, so unpredictable, that no rational adversary would attempt it. Qasem Soleimani did not invent that doctrine. He perfected it. He was born in 1957 in a small village in Kerman province, the son of a farmer so poor that Soleimani reportedly left school at 13 to help pay off a debt his father owed to the government. He joined the Revolutionary Guards in 1979, the year of the revolution. He was 22. He had no formal military training. What he had was an instinctive grasp of human networks, of loyalty, of how men decide whom to fight for. By the time the Iran-Iraq war ended, he had distinguished himself enough to be given command of a Quds Force unit. By the late 1990s, he was running the entire operation. What the Quds Force became under Soleimani is something that Western military analysts spent years underestimating, and the underestimation cost lives. It was not simply a paramilitary organization. It was a foreign policy instrument, an intelligence service, a construction firm, a bank, and an ideological movement simultaneously. Soleimani did not just arm Hezbollah in Lebanon. He trained their engineers, built their tunnel networks, integrated their command and control with Iranian satellite intelligence. He did not just fund Hamas. He negotiated ceasefires between Palestinian factions that the Egyptian government could not broker. In Iraq, after the American invasion of 2003, Quds Force operatives were present within weeks, building relationships with Shia militias that would eventually give Iran more effective influence over the Iraqi government than the United States had after spending $2 trillion and losing nearly 4,500 soldiers. That number deserves a moment. $2 trillion. And Iran spent a fraction of that and achieved comparable strategic depth inside the same country. The killing of Soleimani on the 3rd of January 2020 was presented to the American public as a decapitation strike, the removal of the architect of Iranian aggression. What the Trump administration did not explain, and what most coverage did not examine, was what the strike failed to accomplish. The Quds Force did not collapse. The proxy network did not dissolve. The infrastructure Soleimani had built over 2 decades had been deliberately designed to survive exactly that kind of strike. Within 6 months of his death, Iranian-aligned militias in Iraq had resumed attacks on American positions. Within a year, Hezbollah had received new weapons shipments. Within 2 years, the Houthis in Yemen were firing missiles at Saudi oil infrastructure with a precision that their pre-Soleimani capability could not have achieved. The network was not a man. The man had been a node. And networks do not die when you kill a node. But here is what almost nobody discussed at the time. The Iranian ballistic missile strikes on Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, launched on the 8th of January 2020, 4 days after Soleimani's death, were not a symbolic gesture. Iranian forces fired 16 Qiyam and Fateh 3 13 ballistic missiles. The accuracy was extraordinary, tighter than anything Iran had publicly demonstrated before. American personnel had received some warning and had taken cover, which is the reason why the casualty figure was not in the hundreds. 110 American service members were diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries, a figure the Trump administration initially said was 0. But the structural point is this: Iran chose the level of casualties it wanted to inflict. It could have aimed differently. It demonstrated to every military analyst in the world that it possessed the precision to hit whatever it decided to hit, and that it was choosing to exercise restraint as a signal, not as a limitation. That signal was received in Washington. It was also received in Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and Moscow. Which brings us to the geography. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a shipping lane, it is the single most consequential geographic choke point on the planet for the global economy as it currently functions, and almost no one in the Western public understands quite how vulnerable it is, or quite how deliberately Iran has positioned itself to exploit that vulnerability. The strait is at its narrowest point roughly 33 kilometers wide. The navigable shipping channel is divided into 2 lanes, each 3 kilometers wide, with a 3-kilometer buffer between them. 21 million barrels of oil pass through it every single day. That is roughly 20% of the world's total oil consumption. The economies of Japan, South Korea, India, China, and most of Western Europe are structurally dependent on that flow continuing. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself export through it. If the strait closes, the global economy does not slow down, it seizes. Iran has spent 30 years building the capacity to close. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy operates a doctrine called swarm warfare, using large numbers of small, fast, heavily armed patrol boats that can operate in the shallow waters of the strait where American carrier battle groups cannot effectively maneuver. They have deployed anti-ship missile batteries along the Iranian coastline that can range the entire width of the strait. They have practiced laying naval mines, a tactic that proved extraordinarily effective in the 1980s when Iranian mines disabled several tankers and the United States Navy spent months conducting minesweeping operations. They have stationed anti-ship missiles on Abu Musa, Tunb al-Kubra, and Tunb al-Sugra, islands whose ownership is disputed with the United Arab Emirates, but which Iran has occupied since 1971. And they have positioned Fateh-1, 10 short-range ballistic missiles, in caves and tunnels dug into the Zagros mountain range, hardened against airstrikes, relocatable, and capable of hitting any ship in the strait within 90 seconds of launch. A classified assessment produced by the United States Naval War College in 2019, portions of which were described by the journalist and national security scholar Thomas Rid in a 2022 analysis, concluded that a sustained Iranian interdiction campaign in the Strait of Hormuz could reduce oil flow by between 30 and 50% for a period of weeks to months before American forces could fully suppress the threat. In that window, oil prices would spike by a figure the assessment reportedly modeled at between 200 and 400% above baseline. That is not an inconvenience. That is an economic shock comparable to the 1973 Arab oil embargo, but compressed into days instead of months, and without the political release valve that came from negotiating with OPEC. One mine, one tanker, one miscalculation. That is the distance between the current state of tension and a crisis that restructures the global economy. And the people who are most aware of this are sitting in Beijing. This is the layer that almost no Western analysis adequately accounts for. China imports more oil from the Persian Gulf than any other country on Earth. The majority of that oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. China has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in Iranian infrastructure under the 25-year Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement signed in March of 2021. China has been buying Iranian oil at discounted rates in violation of American sanctions, providing Iran with the hard currency that has allowed the Iranian government to avoid the complete economic collapse that Washington's maximum pressure policy was designed to produce. And China has been watching the American approach to the Taiwan question, the Ukraine conflict, and the Iran nuclear file simultaneously, running a strategic calculation about American capacity, credibility, and political will. A United States-Iran war would present Beijing with an extraordinary opportunity and an extraordinary problem at the same time. The opportunity: American military assets would be consumed in the Persian Gulf and the broader Middle East. Carrier strike groups currently positioned to respond to a Taiwan contingency would be redirected. American political attention would fracture. The bandwidth of the American national security apparatus is not infinite. The problem? A prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz would damage the Chinese economy in ways that would create domestic political pressure on the Chinese Communist Party at exactly the moment when Xi Jinping is navigating a real estate crisis and slowing growth. So Beijing's incentive is a specific and calibrated version of the conflict. Enough instability to tie down American power, not enough to strangle Chinese oil supply. That balance requires a very precise Iranian operation, and the question of whether Iran can actually calibrate at that level of precision, or whether the logic of escalation takes over once the first shots are fired, is the question that keeps the people who have actually run the war games awake at night. Here is what those war games have found. The American military conducted a classified exercise in 2002 called Millennium Challenge. It was the largest war game in American military history at the time, costing roughly $250 million. The Red Team, representing a hypothetical adversary with characteristics closely matching Iran, was commanded by retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper. Van Riper used unconventional tactics, motorcycle messengers to avoid electronic surveillance, small boat swarms, surprise missile launches from civilian vessels. In the first 2 days of the simulated conflict, Van Riper's Red Team sank 16 American naval vessels, including an aircraft carrier, 10 cruisers, and 5 amphibious ships. In a real conflict, that would have meant roughly 20,000 American casualties. The simulation was then reset. The rules were changed to prevent Van Riper from using those tactics. Van Riper resigned from the exercise in protest, later telling the Army Times that the war game had been rigged to produce a preferred outcome. The results were not classified at the time. They were simply not reported by mainstream outlets. 23 years later, Iran has substantially more advanced anti-ship missiles than Van Riper's Red Team was modeled to possess. The Noor anti-ship missile, an Iranian reverse-engineered version of the Chinese C-802, has a range of approximately 170 kilometers. The Khalij Fars, first tested in 2011, is a ballistic anti-ship missile, meaning it approaches from above rather than at sea level, making it substantially harder for current close-in weapons systems to intercept. The Hoot, a high-speed supercavitating torpedo, reportedly travels at speeds that render standard American torpedo countermeasures ineffective. And in 2022, Iran unveiled the Fatah hypersonic missile, which Iranian officials claimed reached Mach 13 in tests, a figure that independent analysts viewed with appropriate skepticism, but which nonetheless points toward a sustained Iranian investment in weapons specifically engineered to defeat American naval defenses. None of this means Iran wins a war with the United States. It means the cost of that war, in American lives, in global economic disruption, in regional destabilization, is orders of magnitude higher than the American public has been prepared to accept. And that asymmetry of willingness to absorb cost, that is the core of Iranian deterrence strategy. Iran does not need to defeat the United States military. It needs to make the United States not want to begin the fight. But deterrence only works if both sides believe the other will not miscalculate. And the history of this particular bilateral relationship is a history of almost continuous miscalculation. Remember what was said at the outset. There is a man whose name appears in almost none of the mainstream coverage of this crisis, a figure whose decisions in the 1980s set the architecture for everything that followed. His name was Robert McFarlane. He served as Ronald Reagan's national security advisor, and in the autumn of 1986, he traveled secretly to Tehran carrying a Bible personally signed by Ronald Reagan and a key-shaped cake meant to symbolize the opening of a new relationship. He was carrying something else: American weapons. Anti-tank TOW missiles and spare parts for Hawk anti-aircraft missile batteries, sold to Iran in violation of an arms embargo that the United States had itself imposed, in violation of a stated American policy of never negotiating with hostage takers, in exchange for Iranian help in securing the release of American hostages held in Lebanon by Hezbollah, which was an Iranian proxy. The proceeds from the weapons sales were then illegally diverted to fund the Nicaraguan Contras, circumventing a congressional ban on exactly that funding. The Iran-Contra affair, as it became known, revealed something foundational about the American-Iranian relationship. Beneath the public posture of maximum hostility lay a substrate of secret, transactional contact. Both governments have always been willing to talk when the stakes were high enough. Both governments have always been willing to lie to their own publics about the fact that they were talking. That pattern has repeated itself in every subsequent crisis, in back-channel communications during the nuclear negotiations, in quiet de-escalation messages passed through Swiss intermediaries after the Soleimani killing, in the prisoner exchanges that both Washington and Tehran have conducted while publicly denying any broader diplomatic relationship. What this means is that the war that everyone says is inevitable has been averted repeatedly through exactly these informal channels. And it means that the war becomes possible the moment those channels break down, or the moment a domestic political crisis in either country makes using them too costly for the leadership involved. Iran is in such a moment now. The Islamic Republic's domestic legitimacy has been eroding for a generation. The Green Movement protests of 2009 were suppressed but not forgotten. The protests that erupted in 2022 after the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who died in the custody of Iran's morality police, were the most geographically widespread and politically diverse protests in the history of the Islamic Republic. They were suppressed. The official death toll is disputed. The human rights organization Iran Human Rights, based in Oslo, documented at least 537 deaths in the crackdown. The actual figure is almost certainly higher. Thousands were arrested. Dozens were executed. A government that responds to internal dissent with that level of violence is a government that is aware of its own fragility. And governments that are aware of their own fragility have historically been more likely, not less, to seek external conflict as a mechanism for consolidating domestic unity. The political science literature on this dynamic, what scholars call diversionary war theory, is extensive and contested. But the Iranian case has specific features that make the dynamic more plausible than the general theory suggests. The Iranian economy is under extraordinary stress. American sanctions have removed Iran from the SWIFT international banking system, making routine international financial transactions extraordinarily difficult. Oil revenues, while somewhat restored by the Chinese purchases, remain below the level required to fund both the proxy network and the domestic subsidies on which the government's social compact with its population depends. Inflation in Iran ran at approximately 40% in 2023, according to the International Monetary Fund's Article 4 consultation with Iran, a figure that erodes purchasing power and generates precisely the kind of urban middle-class discontent that the Amini protests represented. The population under 30, which is the majority of Iran's population given its demographic structure, is overwhelmingly connected to the outside world through social media and satellite television, despite government attempts at internet restriction. They know what their peers in Istanbul, Dubai, and Kuala Lumpur have access to. They know what they do not have access to. That gap generates a political pressure that no amount of revolutionary rhetoric resolves. A leadership under this kind of internal pressure faces a specific temptation, not necessarily to start a war because the consequences of a losing war are catastrophic, but to engineer a crisis severe enough to rally nationalist sentiment without crossing the threshold into open conflict. That is a very narrow corridor to navigate. And the history of this relationship suggests that both sides have limited capacity for precision navigation when the domestic pressure is high. The nuclear file makes the corridor narrower still. Iran's nuclear program is not, as it is sometimes presented in Western media, a straightforward attempt to build a bomb that the international community is heroically preventing. The reality is considerably more complex, and the complexity matters because it shapes the decision calculus on both sides. Iran has been a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty since 1970. Under that treaty, Iran has the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. The dispute is not about whether Iran can enrich uranium. The dispute is about the level of enrichment, the quantity of enriched material, and the extent to which Iran's program has components that have no plausible civilian justification. The International Atomic Energy Agency has documented in a series of reports stretching from 2020 to 2024 that Iran has enriched uranium to 60% purity, a level that has no legitimate civilian nuclear energy application, but which is technically only a short processing step below weapons-grade enrichment of 90%. The agency has also documented that Iran has been less than fully transparent about specific sites and specific research programs. Iran's position is that its program is entirely peaceful, that American and Israeli intelligence agencies have fabricated evidence of weaponization research, and that the sanctions regime is itself a form of economic warfare that Iran is entitled to respond to. That position contains genuine elements of truth alongside strategic obfuscation. The fabricated evidence claim has some historical basis. A key piece of evidence about Iranian nuclear weapons work, a document known as the Laptop Documents, was provided to Western intelligence agencies by an opposition group with an obvious interest in triggering military action against Iran, and the document's provenance has never been fully verified to the satisfaction of independent analysts. But the 60% enrichment is not a fabrication. The International Atomic Energy Agency has measured it with its own equipment, and the breakout time, the time Iran would need to enrich enough uranium to weapons grade for a single device, if it decided to do so, has fallen from roughly 12 months in 2020 to roughly 12 days in 2024, according to the agency's own estimates reported in its quarterly safeguards reports. 12 days. That is not a deterrence gap. That is a hair trigger. Israel has made clear, in terms that no serious analyst dismisses as rhetoric, that it considers a nuclear-armed Iran an existential threat and that it will conduct military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities before allowing Iran to reach weapons capability. Israel struck Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981 and Syria's Al-Kabar reactor in 2007. In both cases, the strikes were conducted unilaterally, without American approval, and achieved their immediate military objective. Iran's nuclear infrastructure is substantially more dispersed, hardened, and buried than either of those targets. The Fordo enrichment facility is built inside a mountain. The Natanz facility is buried under 8 meters of reinforced concrete. Neither is vulnerable to conventional Israeli munitions without American-supplied bunker-buster bombs. Specifically, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound guided bomb that only American B-2 Spirit stealth bombers can currently deliver. Israel has made repeated requests for the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. The Biden administration declined to provide it. The Trump administration, in its second term, has been more ambiguous on the question. That ambiguity is itself a form of pressure on Iran. In October of 2024, Israel conducted airstrikes on Iran directly, striking radar installations and air defense systems in Khuzestan and Tehran province. This was the first direct Israeli strike on Iranian soil in the history of the two countries' conflict. Iran's response was calibrated, as it was after the Soleimani killing, to demonstrate capability while avoiding escalation to open war. But the threshold had been crossed. The distinction between strikes on Iranian proxies and strikes on Iran itself had collapsed. When you remove that distinction, you change the decision calculus permanently. Because the Iranian military's deterrence doctrine rests on a specific logic. If you strike our proxies, we respond through the proxy network. If you strike Iranian soil, we respond directly. That logic worked as long as the first category remained inviolable. Once Israel struck Iranian soil and Iran absorbed it without triggering open war, the logic fractured. Iran's leaders face a dilemma. If they respond at the level the doctrine demands, they risk a wider conflict they may not be able to control. If they absorb the strike without a proportionate response, they signal that the doctrine is hollow, which invites further strikes. There is no clean exit from that dilemma, and the United States is not a passive observer. The relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv on the Iran question has been one of the most consequential and least transparent relationships in contemporary international affairs. Israel's security is a stated core interest of American foreign policy. The United States provides Israel with approximately $3.8 billion in military assistance annually under a Memorandum of Understanding signed in 2016 and extended through 2028. American and Israeli intelligence agencies share information on Iran continuously through a joint working group whose existence was confirmed in congressional testimony in 2021. When Israel conducts operations against Iran-aligned targets in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, those operations are conducted with awareness of American assets in the region and with coordination that falls somewhere on the spectrum between tacit approval and active deconfliction. What that means in practice is that an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities would not, in the real world, be a unilateral Israeli decision in any meaningful sense. It would require decisions about American asset positioning, about air corridor access, about what American air defenses in the region do and do not engage. Those decisions would be made in Washington, and Iran knows this. From Iran's perspective, an Israeli strike on its nuclear facilities is an American strike conducted by a proxy. That reframing is not paranoia. It is a rational reading of the structural relationship between the two allies. If Iran responds to an Israeli strike by targeting American assets, which its doctrine would suggest it must, the United States is in a war regardless of whether any American aircraft crossed Iranian airspace. That is the mechanism. That is how a war that neither government may actively want becomes a war that neither government can stop. The proxy network adds another ignition point, and this is where the picture becomes genuinely difficult to manage. Iran's network of non-state armed groups, what Iranian officials sometimes call the axis of resistance, is not a command and control hierarchy in the conventional military sense. Hezbollah in Lebanon has its own political interests, its own financial base, its own relationship with the Lebanese state that predates and will outlast any particular Iranian foreign policy objective. Hamas in Gaza has its own internal divisions, its own relationship with Qatar and Turkey that give it diplomatic channels Iran does not control. The Houthi movement in Yemen, formerly known as Ansar Allah, emerged from a Zaydi Shia revivalism that is theologically distinct from Iranian Twelver Shia Islam, and that was conducting armed operations against the Yemeni government long before Soleimani's Quds force began providing it with missiles and targeting intelligence. These are not Iranian puppets. They are Iranian partners with their own strategic interests, and partners make decisions that principals do not fully control. The Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023 killed approximately 1,200 Israelis and took roughly 250 hostages. The attack was planned with a level of operational security that apparently surprised Iranian officials, according to reporting by the Wall Street Journal in the weeks following the attack, citing American intelligence assessments. Iran had been informed of Hamas's intention to conduct a major operation, but apparently not of its precise timing or scale. The attack triggered an Israeli military response in Gaza that killed, according to Gaza's health ministry figures as of late 2024, more than 40,000 Palestinians. It triggered a Hezbollah escalation on Israel's northern border that eventually drew Israeli ground forces into southern Lebanon for the first time since 2006. It drew American carrier strike groups into the eastern Mediterranean. It drew Houthi missile and drone attacks on Red Sea shipping that disrupted global supply chains and triggered American and British airstrikes on Houthi positions in Yemen. It nearly triggered a direct Israeli-Iranian exchange that was only diffused through intensive back-channel communication in April of 2024, when Iran launched its first direct strike on Israeli territory, firing over 300 drones and missiles, the vast majority of which were intercepted by the Israeli, American, British, Jordanian, and Saudi air defense systems working in coordination. 300 drones, multiple nations working together to shoot them down. That is not a crisis that managed itself. That is a crisis that was managed, barely, by a coalition of governments, all of whom had strong reasons to prevent escalation, and who nonetheless came within a single miscalculation of losing control. Remove any one of those governments from the coalition. Remove the Jordanian air defense cooperation, which Amman provided at significant domestic political cost given its population's sympathies. Remove the Saudi tacit cooperation, remove the American assets, and the April 2024 exchange produces a different outcome. Those conditions will not hold indefinitely. Domestic politics in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in the United States are not static. And the next exchange will not necessarily come with the same warning time, the same communications channels, the same coalition in place. Here is where the structural dynamics converge into something specific and near-term. The Trump administration's second-term Iran policy has moved toward what officials have described as maximum pressure 2.0, an intensification of the sanctions regime that pushed Iranian oil exports to their lowest levels since the 1980s during Trump's first term. The policy rests on a theory that sufficient economic pressure will force Iran to negotiate a new nuclear deal on American terms or produce sufficient domestic unrest to destabilize the Islamic Republic. The first theory has not been validated by evidence. Iran's response to maximum pressure in the first term was to accelerate its nuclear program, not to pause it. The enrichment level went from under 4% in 2018 to 60% in 2024. The second theory has not been validated either. The Amini protests did not produce regime change. They produced a crackdown that strengthened the security services and hardened the government's internal control mechanisms. What maximum pressure has consistently produced is a dynamic in which Iranian hardliners, who argue that accommodation with the West is structurally impossible and that deterrence through military capability is the only rational strategy, are empowered at the expense of Iranian pragmatists who argue for diplomatic engagement. This is not a novel observation. It was made by European diplomatic officials in notes that were leaked to the German newspaper Der Spiegel in 2019, by former Obama administration officials in published analyses, and by the independent scholar Suzanne Maloney of the Brookings Institution in a widely cited 2021 paper. The sanctions pressure that is designed to weaken Iran's negotiating position has the structural effect of strengthening the faction within the Iranian government that does not want to negotiate. The Trump administration's second-term team is aware of this analysis and has rejected it. The position, articulated by National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and by Special Envoy for the Middle East Steve Witkoff in their public statements in 2025, is that Iran's past willingness to negotiate when under maximum pressure demonstrates that the policy works if applied with sufficient resolve, and that previous administrations failed by offering sanctions relief prematurely. The empirical disagreement between these two positions is genuine. Neither side can point to a clean, controlled experiment, but the stakes of getting the analysis wrong are not symmetric. If the administration's critics are correct and maximum pressure accelerates rather than prevents conflict, the downside is a regional war. If the administration is correct and pressure produces a deal, the upside is a nuclear agreement that may or may not hold. That asymmetry should produce caution. It has not. In the spring of 2025, the Trump administration sent a letter to Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei proposing direct negotiations over the nuclear program. Khamenei initially declined, characterizing the offer as a trap. Back-channel communications through Omani intermediaries, the same channel used in the 1980s and throughout the nuclear negotiations of the Obama era, eventually produced agreement to indirect talks in Rome and then in Muscat. The status of those talks, as of the available public record, is unresolved. Both sides have acknowledged the existence of the channel. Neither has acknowledged what has been communicated through it. What we know from the pattern of the previous 30 years is this. When these back-channel communications are active and substantive, the probability of military escalation decreases. When they break down, or when domestic political pressure makes using them too costly for one or both governments, the probability of escalation increases sharply. The communications are currently active, but the conditions that could break them down are also currently active. Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is 85 years old. He has governed Iran since 1989. The question of succession has been an open and intensely contested one within the Iranian political system for at least a decade. The candidate most frequently named in analyses of the succession question is Mojtaba Khamenei, the Supreme Leader's son, a figure with no public profile, no governmental position, and, according to reporting by Iranian journalists in exile, significant influence within the Revolutionary Guards. A succession to Mujtaba Khamenei would be unprecedented in the Islamic Republic's history, which has always maintained the formal position that the supreme leader is chosen by clerical consensus rather than dynastic inheritance. Such a succession would face internal opposition from within the clerical establishment. A government navigating a contested succession crisis is a government with less bandwidth for careful crisis management, more susceptibility to internal factions, using external conflict as a tool for consolidating position. The succession question is not a distant hypothetical. It is an active variable in the current strategic environment. Israel's domestic politics add another variable of comparable instability. The coalition governing Israel as of 2025 includes ministers from the far-right religious Zionism Party, specifically Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, both of whom have publicly advocated for Israeli military action against Iran, and both of whom have, at various points, advocated for positions on Gaza and the West Bank that the Israeli military itself has described as operationally counterproductive. A government that requires the support of these ministers to maintain its parliamentary majority is a government with a constrained range of diplomatic options and an expanded range of military options. Benjamin Netanyahu's own political survival has been intertwined with the Gaza conflict in ways that multiple Israeli analysts, including former Mossad director Tamir Pardo in a 2024 interview with the Associated Press, have described as creating a structural incentive for Netanyahu to prolong rather than resolve the conflict. Pardo used the word catastrophe to describe the current direction of Israeli policy. He is not a fringe figure. He ran Israeli foreign intelligence. When the domestic politics of both Israel and Iran simultaneously push toward escalation, and when the United States is internally divided about the cost it is willing to bear to prevent that escalation, the structural conditions for a war that no individual leader may actually want are maximally present. That is the condition that currently exists. The financial markets have not fully priced this. The oil futures curve as of mid-2025 reflects a moderate geopolitical risk premium, but nothing approaching the kind of disruption scenario that a Strait of Hormuz closure would produce. Analysts at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan have published notes acknowledging the risk while characterizing it as a tail risk rather than a base case. This is the same framing that characterized the mortgage-backed securities risk in 2006. Tail risks that are structurally inevitable become base cases. The question is only timing. The Houthis are still firing. Red Sea shipping costs are still elevated. The insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern entrance to the Red Sea, reached levels in 2024 that had not been seen since the peak of the Somali piracy crisis. Container ships have been rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days to transit times between Asia and Europe. That rerouting has increased global shipping costs, contributed to inflationary pressure in European consumer economies, and strained the capacity of Cape Town's port infrastructure. And the Houthis are doing this with a fraction of the capability Iran has positioned in and around the Strait of Hormuz itself. Now recall the figure from earlier. The breakout time for Iran's nuclear program: 12 days. In 2020, it was 12 months. 4 years of enrichment activity, conducted while the United States was imposing maximum pressure sanctions, while Israel was conducting covert operations against Iranian nuclear scientists and facilities, while the International Atomic Energy Agency was issuing quarterly reports documenting the acceleration, produced a reduction from 12 months to 12 days. That trajectory does not suggest a program that is being constrained. It suggests a program that is racing. And a program that is racing toward a breakout capability that Israel has publicly said it will not permit creates a specific endpoint that both the geography and the politics are currently converging toward. The question is not whether there is a mechanism by which this ends in open conflict. The mechanism exists, and it is clearly visible to anyone looking. The question is whether the conditions for the mechanism to fire will align before the conditions for a diplomatic resolution align. The conditions for conflict are an Israeli decision that Iran has crossed the nuclear threshold, a breakdown in the back-channel communications between Washington and Tehran, a Houthi or Hezbollah action that kills American service members in sufficient numbers to trigger a congressional political crisis, or an Iranian domestic political transition that brings to power a faction with less interest in managing escalation. Any one of these conditions, occurring without a countervailing diplomatic development, is sufficient. The conditions for resolution are a nuclear deal that verifiably limits Iranian enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief, sustained by a domestic political coalition in both Washington and Tehran willing to pay the cost of that deal, and accompanied by some form of regional security architecture that addresses the underlying Iranian security concerns that the nuclear program is partly designed to address. The second set of conditions requires more simultaneous variables to align. It is harder. It has been tried and partially achieved in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action of 2015, and then destroyed by a unilateral American decision to withdraw in 2018. The institutional memory of that withdrawal is now baked into every Iranian calculation. The lesson Iranian officials drew from it was that a negotiated agreement with the United States is only as durable as the American political cycle, which rotates every 4 years. Building a nuclear deterrent that does not depend on an American signature is a rational response to that lesson. Which means the withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action did not simply end a deal. It altered the Iranian cost-benefit calculation in a way that makes the next deal harder to achieve and harder to sustain. That is the inheritance. 1953, 1988, 1986's Iran-Contra, 2003's invasion of Iraq and the strategic gift it handed Tehran, 2018's withdrawal from the nuclear deal. A cascade of decisions, most of them made without serious consideration of second-order effects, each one narrowing the corridor through which a non-military resolution remains possible. the man who funded the initial covert network that became the Quds Force, who authorized the weapons transfers that kept the Islamic Republic solvent during the Iran-Iraq War, even as Washington was officially supporting Baghdad, who made the specific decision that taught Iranian leaders their first lesson about the gap between American stated policy and American actual behavior, was William Casey, director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1981 to 1987. Casey died in May of 1987, 1 month after resigning due to a brain tumor, before he could testify before Congress about Iran-Contra. His role in the specific Iran-Contra transactions remains partially documented and partially obscured. What is documented in the congressional record of the 1987 Joint Committee investigation is that the structure he oversaw created relationships, habits of mind, and operational patterns that his successors inherited, and that the Islamic Republic's intelligence services mapped in forensic detail. Understanding Casey is understanding the original template for the double game that both governments have been playing ever since. Public hostility, private transaction, mutual instrumentalization. The relationship has never been what either government has told its public it is. And that gap between public posture and private reality is itself one of the mechanisms by which miscalculation becomes possible, because it means that neither population is adequately prepared for what its government might actually do. The American public does not know what is in the back-channel communications with Tehran. The Iranian public does not know what Khamenei has communicated through the Omani intermediaries. Both populations are making political judgments based on incomplete pictures. In a democracy, that incomplete picture constrains the options of elected leaders who might otherwise see a path through. In Iran's system, the incomplete picture is a tool of control. But it also means that when the crisis comes, the public shock on both sides will be profound, because neither population has been prepared for the reality that the other side has been calculating. And the crisis will produce its own logic. The first American casualty from an Iranian missile will produce a political demand for response that no administration can entirely resist. The first Iranian civilian casualty from an American airstrike will produce a domestic pressure on the Iranian government that will make back-channel de-escalation politically toxic. The first closure of the Strait of Hormuz will produce a global economic panic that creates pressure for rapid military resolution, regardless of whether rapid military resolution is actually achievable. Speed becomes the enemy of judgment, and in a crisis involving ballistic missiles with flight times measured in minutes, speed is the only constant. The scenario that analysts consider most dangerous is not a deliberate decision by either government to start a war. Both governments are aware of the costs. Both have shown willingness to absorb significant provocations without crossing into open conflict, as the record from 2020 to 2024 demonstrates. The dangerous scenario is the accident that neither side planned, and neither side knows how to stop once it starts. An Iranian anti-ship missile fired from a Revolutionary Guards fast boat during a confrontation in the Strait, striking an American destroyer and killing 40 sailors. Not because the Iranian government ordered it, but because a Revolutionary Guards commander on the water made a decision in real time that exceeded his authorization. That scenario, or something functionally equivalent, is not a distant hypothetical. An incident of almost exactly this type nearly occurred in January of 2008, when Iranian speedboats approached American warships in the Strait and radio communications included what appeared to be a threat. The incident was diffused. The boat commanders were never clearly identified. The chain of command on the Iranian side remained opaque. Or the inverse. An American aircraft misidentifies an Iranian military aircraft and shoots it down over the strait. It has happened before. In July of 1988, the United States Navy guided missile cruiser Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655, killing all 290 people aboard. The American government maintained that the crew had misidentified the aircraft as a military threat. The Iranian government characterized it as a deliberate attack. The United States paid compensation without admitting legal liability. The memory of it is vivid in Iranian institutional memory in a way that is difficult to overstate. That institutional memory cuts both ways. It makes Iranian commanders more likely to see American provocations as intentional rather than accidental, which means an accidental American action is more likely to produce an intentional Iranian response, which is precisely how accidents escalate into wars. The people in the best position to prevent that escalation are the people in those back-channel communications. As long as those channels are open and trusted, the moment they are not, the people in the best position to start that escalation are the commanders on the water, the pilots in the cockpit, the Revolutionary Guards officer whose radio call reaches the wrong ship. The strait is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The flight time of an Iranian ballistic anti-ship missile from a coastal battery to a ship in the middle of the navigable channel is under 2 minutes. The decision time available to the commander of that ship is measured in seconds, and the political decision time available to the governments on both sides, once the first exchange has occurred, is measured in hours. Hours in which the global oil price will spike. Hours in which congressional phones will be ringing. Hours in which Israeli officials will be calculating whether this is the moment. Hours in which Chinese officials will be deciding whether to use their diplomatic channel to Tehran or to step back and let the crisis develop. Hours in which every proxy in the network will be receiving guidance about whether to activate or hold. That is the world the current trajectory is building toward. Not because anyone has decided to build it, because the structural logic of decades of compounded decisions, each one rational in isolation, has constructed an architecture in which the most dangerous outcome is also the most probable one. The first covert payment was made in 1953. The first proxy war began in 1982. The first direct military exchange happened in 2024. The breakout timeline is now 12 days, and the back channel is open but fragile, sustained by intermediaries in a small Gulf sultanate between two governments that have never fully trusted each other and have specific structural reasons not. There is a file in the archives of the Omani Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Muscat that contains a record of every communication passed between Washington and Tehran through that channel since the 1980s. It is not public. It will not be public for decades. But it exists. And somewhere in it is a record of the moment when each previous crisis was walked back from the edge. The question is whether there will be a record of this one. Tell us in the comments which part of this story they never taught in school. That file sits in Muscat. The enrichment centrifuges spin in Fordow, inside the mountain, 30 meters below the rock. The fast boats train in the strait every week. And somewhere in a targeting system database, the coordinates of an American carrier are already loaded.